Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fertility Confidence Podcast. I have an interview with Brooklyn based chef and author Phoebe Lapine set up for you today. And it was such a wonderful conversation. I think we actually went in like 6 different directions than we were probably supposed to. I know she had like a wonderful fertility and surrogacy journey to share with us that we honestly didn't even touch on. So Phoebe and I talked about having her back on the podcast to talk about her experience with surrogacy. But we really went down the rabbit hole of carbohydrates and your thyroid and your gut and how all of these are just really important conversations to have as a woman in general, but especially as a woman who is trying to conceive. And if you are a fertility confidence podcast listener, we've had a lot of conversations around how stress and your gut and your thyroid and your hormone balance, how all of these things play a role in your fertility success. And so it was so wonderful to get to just hear Phoebe's side of things as someone who is so passionate about food and cooking. She has an award-winning blog, Feed Me Phoebe, which I will post in the show notes for you. There's tons of free recipes. They're gluten-free recipes, as well as recipes on how to just have a more carb-inclusive diet. We spoke to the concept of diet culture and how a lot of us, grew up in the 90s and carbs were bad and we all ate margarine and how, we have these extreme opinions and especially in the fertility space, there's a lot of extreme vibes around how you should eat and have to eat to get pregnant. And I just love Phoebe's take on it being just a lot more inclusive, more about how do we add things in? How do we have balance without feeling like epic restriction? And she just has a really wonderful outlook on what that looks like with this. I think kind of like, I don't want to say outsider because she definitely isn't, but as a chef, she has like a very, and as a research-based chef, her books have a really good meld of the research, the data, how this impacts things. And then now that you've learned, here's some amazing recipes. So you can catch and find her new book called Carbivore. She let us know to be careful with autocorrect. But I'll pop the link for you to check out her cookbooks, to check out her blog, and then you can go find her over on Instagram at Phoebe Lapine, and that link will be down there in the show notes for you as well. So I hope you enjoy. As always, if you did enjoy this episode, share it with a friend or family member that maybe needs to hear it. Give us a like and subscribe so that our wonderful podcast juju can get sent out to other women and couples who are trying to conceive. And I will see you guys in the next episode. I was reading through your bio and putting some thoughts to paper this morning, and I was giggling to myself because I find in my practice things kind of like ebb and flow in waves and come in clumps. And I've probably had more nutrition and macro calculations and carb, we have to be eating this and this and this conversations the last couple of weeks. And so I think this is just like a perfect little bow to this pocket of nutrition combos that I've been having to get to hear a little bit about your story and your books and talk a bit about the more specific aspect of like carbs, nutrition, and fertility.
Awesome. Can't wait.
Why don't you start with sharing a little bit about you and about your story?
Yeah. So my big turning point health-wise was when I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis when I was 22. And I now know in hindsight that I was really lucky to be diagnosed by just my regular PCP, who did a full thyroid panel, which is rare. However, I was very young at the time and not mature enough to know what to do with that diagnosis. And she being kind of more of a Western-minded practitioner, really only gave me one avenue to go down, which was here's some medication. You'll be on it for the rest of your life, but it's no big deal. And just in my heart of hearts, I thought, well, no, like being on medication for the rest of my life sounds like a really big deal. And I'm just not going to do that. I don't feel so bad. So I just went on living my life and pretended that the conversation never happened. And that is where my journey, my downhill climb began. And I say that I kind of landed on my butt at the bottom of Health Mountain with all of these symptoms that, again, I hadn't done enough research or any research at all about my autoimmune condition to know to tie those things to this thyroid diagnosis. But, my hair was falling out, my skin was a mess. I had to stop exercising because I had just a horrible cramp every time I tried to run like one block. And, I was exhausted all the time, hallmark Hashimoto's symptom, but had insomnia and couldn't sleep through the night. I had all these night sweats. I was basically just a hot mess. And eventually I did what I should have done when I was 22, and I went to a more integrative practitioner who kind of helped me by starting an elimination diet and just explaining the diet side of things. Helped me, with some supplementation to get my gut in better shape. But I kind of discovered through that process that gluten and I did not get along. And I know a lot of people with Hashimoto's who are in a similar boat. So that was almost 15 years ago, before most people were gluten-free.
Mhm.
And ironically, I had quit my corporate job a few years prior to try and become, a chef and food writer full time. And so learning that I had any sort of food or dietary restrictions was really overwhelming and scary as someone trying to make a career as an omnivore. And certainly the landscape of gluten-free options and gluten-free awareness is not what it is today. So fortunately, I had the skills in the kitchen to kind of heal myself, make things work, and shifted my POV from a career and professional standpoint. But it was not without many stages of grief.
Yeah, yeah. I'm currently in my first stage of gluten grief. As I've
Oh.
come to terms with the fact that it does not suit my body. And I have these
Mm.
conversations with clients too all the time of, it's going to take time to adjust and to figure it out. And hearing you talk about, obviously with how you change your careers, you like to cook and that brings you joy. That's not me. I despise being in the kitchen. So for me, for someone like me, where I'm like, okay, don't want to cook. Luckily, my husband takes great care of me and I eat
Mm.
well-rounded, lovely meals all day, every day. But then to be like, okay, if I have to do this and he doesn't, now we're finding this balance of how do I at least minimize it without throwing our whole family for a loop. And
Mm.
it is a challenge. Even now, 15 years ago, you're so right. There wasn't a lot of resources, there wasn't a lot of options, there wasn't a lot of awareness. We have that now, but it's still not easy to
Yeah,
change that aspect of how you're eating.
it gets easier. I promise you. You'll get the hang of it. Your husband will get the hang
Yeah.
of it. Whoever's doing the
If we
cooking.
could just get him all the information, that would be great.
Yes, you'll just give him my books and just be
Right.
like, "Go on,
Yeah.
go on."
And to wrap this into this concept of, remind me what your book is called again. It's Carbivore, right?
Carbivore is the latest one. And then my previous one was about SIBO, actually, the small
Cool.
intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that is kind of a hybrid patient guide and cookbook. All the recipes in that one are low FODMAP. All the recipes in Carbivore are gluten. I call them gluten optional, but they are
Yeah.
gluten free. But you can use, regular pasta or regular bread if you
Yeah.
wanted to.
That's awesome.
And then my first cookbook was none of these things because, again, ironically, it came out right as I was learning that I had to be gluten free. And so my first cookbook tour, I made 500 cookies for all of our parties and I couldn't eat any of them. So
Oh,
again, stages of
no.
grief.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully everyone else got to enjoy them though.
For sure.
Yeah.
They're
So, okay, let's
delicious.
talk about. So, we're having a conversation around gluten wasn't great for you. We had to cut it out, but we know that carbs are still important for the thyroid. So, how do you meld those two together in terms of your health?
Yeah, I think they're, with increased awareness about autoimmune issues and, I mean, chronic illnesses in general. It's all positive on a macro scale. But I do think that it does fuel diet culture kind of catching up and interfering with some of these messages. In terms of keto being so on the rise, even autoimmune paleo
Yeah.
as a tactic, isn't necessarily necessary for every single autoimmune disease in order to heal. It kind of depends on where you're at. And I do think that all of these things, low carb approaches in general, or more restrictive diets, and I put low FODMAP in that camp as well, can be really helpful in a short term therapeutic application, which is generally what the data is backing, not necessarily as an ongoing lifestyle. And the reason why, a lot of women do struggle or reach at least a point of kind of diminishing returns when they incorporate low carb approaches for a very long period of time is that, our bodies are so sensitive, we're so finely calibrated. And when there's not, kind of quick energy available, as certainly there isn't with a keto approach, it's kind of the whole point of it is to find fuel from within. It's a signal to our body that we are starving. And when we're starving, our body knows intuitively that it's not a great time to incubate another life. And that's when we start to see changes in our cycle. And certainly our thyroid is part of that picture. I mean, all of our hormones kind of work in tandem and in harmony. And so when you have any sort of shift across the motherboard, you're going to see some issues kind of crop up in other places. And we definitely need readily available glucose in order to produce and convert our thyroid hormones. Like we just do. Unfortunately, most people who try a keto approach are just not going to get enough of that energy to be able to produce what we need to produce.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is such an important conversation in the fertility space, specifically because we are seeing a lot of keto recommendations in the fertility world, but we're not actually seeing the research to back that up. And I think your approach, and this is what I teach people as well, is like maybe for some people, specifically with keto, there's a little bit of PCOS research, but we're looking at short pockets of time, right? And it's the same with intermittent fasting. Like we're looking at short pockets of time in a certain subset of people that also have, like the asterisk here is that they also have great cortisol balance and regulation. And unfortunately, like 8 out of 10 women probably don't have great adrenal health and how that interconnects into things as well. So finding a more sustainable way of eating that's not how do I change my diet to fix the problem in this moment, but how do I change my diet to actually help me live a long and happy, healthy life is really where the conversation needs to go.
Yeah. And I acknowledge that it's tough. I mean, the reason why any diet are so popular is because some people really prefer kind of a black and white approach. But especially for women, again, we are so finely calibrated that we need to have a little bit more nuance in our life. We need to kind of find that Goldilocks sweet spot, because obviously too many carbs, can lead to all sorts of problems, especially for people with PCOS or any sort of insulin dysfunction or sensitivity. So I'm not saying everyone needs to go out and like carb load all the times in order to be healthy. It is unfortunately, a harder ask for women, but it's important that everyone kind of finds their own carb adventure that makes them feel energized and without those midday energy crashes or cravings. And it is possible, again, to do that while eating carbs.
Yeah. So for women who are listening and they're like, okay, I hear you, but what does that look like? Obviously, it's a very individualized and personalized approach when it comes to exactly how much carbs is good for you. But is there a good range that in general, most women should be aiming for?
I'm not a dietitian or a practitioner of any sort, so I always refrain from giving people my recommended macro breakdown. But I do think that my approach is definitely more of a diet skewed approach. So in terms of looking at just like the ratios on your plate, I always like to see kind of 50% vegetables, 50% plants, and having the carbs and the animal protein filling in the smaller quadrant of that. And there are so many different ways to go about it. Kind of the way that I design recipes in the cookbook is it's not rocket science. I'm just trying to add as much healthy fat, protein, and fiber, most importantly, fiber, as possible, not necessarily to offset the carbs, but to make sure that the carbs kind of slow their roll to your bloodstream. So I say that the approach is slow carb, not low carb, because that's really the issue, is not necessarily, how many carbs, how many grams of carbs are in your meal. It's how they're going to be hitting your bloodstream, because you don't want to have too much of a good thing all at once. And kind of what we've learned is the best way to slow down those carbs is to have as much fiber on your plate as possible, and preferably to have fiber in your system before you eat simple sugars or before you eat carbs or starches that are going to be broken down a little bit more quickly.
Is that why people eat salads first?
Yes, it is. It's why the Italians have their antipasti, whether that's vegetables or salumi, but all of those things before the primi course, which is the pasta usually. We see examples of this in many different cultures. It's so funny because I am a big believer in like the data, the nutritional science, but I'm also a big believer in learning from our ancestors, because I think a lot of the common sense things, the intuitive things that we've found just in living our daily lives and what makes us feel better, you can find data for anything and cherry pick data for anything, but those are kind of the lasting lessons that we need to re-recognize. You see it in Japanese culture, eating the edamame before you eat your sushi or your white rice, adding sesame seeds or gomasio as a condiment. It's like a sesame seed condiment on top of that rice. There's so many lessons that we can find in other cultures and cuisines that kind of fit the blood sugar balancing strategies that people talk about today.
Yeah, I love that. We teach a very visual system as well. So I think it's a really, like, I don't want to use the word easy, but it's a simple switch to be like, okay, look at your plate. Is it mostly carbs with a little bit of veggies, or is it veggies with a little bit of carbs? And then how can we just kind of flip those two quadrants side by side so that you are actually increasing your veggies? And this is a very like North American standard diet culture right now. It's very carb heavy. We eat out. Usually meals are mostly carbs with a little bit of protein and a little bit of veg. And we can make being eating out obviously is a different beast, like having to make some adjustments there. But at home, really easy to just bookend our carbs with the other macros. And then I love that you brought up the fiber, because I think especially for women, that's something we're usually under eating. That's so important for hormone metabolism and healthy guts and poops and all the things.
And it's really not hard to apply. I mean, I even joke, have some peanuts on the bar before you have, your glass of wine or beer or whatever it is. That's just like a really small thing that you can do. And if you're home, have, a handful of almonds before your meal, have a salad starter, what have you. But even in terms of, shifting those ratios, you can do it in baby steps over time. And I do like to kind of focus on adding instead of taking away. So it's kind of taking your favorite comfort food recipes and being like, okay, well, what if we add a handful of spinach to that today? That's not going to really offset the quadrant that much, but it's a baby step in the right direction. And I think that people do slowly change their taste buds, specifically in terms of sugar, for sure. And there's always a way to kind of, if we're going to take away anything, we can pare back on the sugar a little bit, which also is, I'm going to go on a tangent, but I think it gets really confusing in the carb conversation, because I think really we should be just talking about sugar most of the time. And
Yeah.
sugar kind of becomes this like get out of jail free card for people who are trying to do low carb even. And I think that if we can just be a little bit better about paring back on the sugar, that actually leaves more room to enjoy our carby comfort foods.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's a journey we're on in our house right now with my
Mm,
husband, and we've done a lot of like tweaks to our nutrition. It was good, but we'd kind of fallen in a rut, and we're working through a program, and that was kind of like the last thing where we were like, we've made all these adjustments, and then but still look at how much sugar you're having. And so now over the last
mm,
week since we came back from our trip, like more mindful, and um even after just 5 days of doing that, he said literally today at lunch, he was like, I don't crave it as
yeah.
much. I'm not constantly looking for something sweet after I have a meal. And I was like, that is amazing, first off, but that's also going to make it so much easier to just keep going. And then now when you have
Yeah.
something sweet, it's always funny when you haven't really had a ton of sugar. I think life should be sweet. We're all going to have some sugar, some
Absolutely.
bad process, like, we're going to have the good, the tasty but not healthy sugar when the time arises. And it's so funny to me when we've been really good with added sugar and excess sugar in our diets, how overly sweet those
Hmm.
nostalgic things that we used to love, that used to not really feel that sweet in the moment, are because our taste buds have changed.
Yes. And your taste buds change over every 14 days. So our brains are always going to be hardwired to want sugar. It's not you. It's not a matter of
Yeah.
willpower. It is biology working against you and the industrialized food system. But we can really fall back and rely on our taste buds to kind of key us into what, a
Mhm.
safer threshold of sugar is.
Yeah, absolutely. So for our women, because when we're talking about reproduction, we're all sort of in the same age bracket, and we all grew up in the same diet culture mindset, right? So something we talk
90s. Yeah.
about in FCM so much. For our women who are really just still fearful of carbs because that's all we heard for decades, like how do we help them overcome that fear?
Oh man. I mean, I think it's interesting to do it through experimentation. I was really lucky in that when I was writing this book or in the research stage, I did a program through Zoe, which sends you a continuous glucose monitor and kind of helps you kind of experiment with a few different food applications to kind of understand some of the science behind these blood sugar strategies. But again, with my elimination diet when I was in my 20s, I think it's so important to viscerally feel the differences in terms of what you're eating. So I have some of these written out in the book, but the best time to do it is in the morning. Our blood sugar is, I wouldn't say the most volatile, but what we eat in the morning will have the biggest impact on our blood sugar, both during that meal and with all the meals that follow, because we have been fasting overnight and are starting with a very empty tank. I know I mentioned, the things that slow our carbs roll, fat, fiber, and protein. And again, like when we don't have anything in our system, any of those things, if we eat something sweet, it can reach our bloodstream really, really quickly, like within 5 minutes, if there's no other macros there or fiber to slow it down. So an experiment could look like, starting the day with a bowl of rice and seeing what happens. It's not pretty, let me tell you. And then the next day, you can start with that same bowl of rice, but you can try the fiber first mantra. You can eat half an avocado before it and see, oh, my energy was a little bit steadier when I did that. You can try the third day, eating them both together. Might not be kind of as big of an impact as eating it prior, but still helpful. You can eat it, maybe just the plain bowl of rice, and then go for a brisk 10-minute walk after. You may be surprised by how impactful that is. And I do think it's important to try all of these tools on for size because we're all really different.
Yeah.
And we some of them may be more powerful for one person than another. And then more importantly, some of them may be more enjoyable for you than another. And I do think we can pick and choose and kind of layer these strategies so that we're not just like living an insane life where we eat lunch and then have to go immediately, for a run up and down the stairwell, like in between floors. You don't have to kind of justify your carbs or your meals in that way. But I do think through experimentation, you can find, again, that kind of Goldilocks happy medium that works for you. And I'll also say, just as you and I are very different, we can eat the same slice of cake and you may be fine and I may be, completely crashing an hour afterwards. But that same piece of cake not only is different for me and you, but it may be different for me tomorrow than it was today. And certainly it'll be different for me when I'm 5 years older than I am right now. So we do have to get in the habit of investing in these experiments, investing in our own self-awareness at meals so that we can learn from them. And hey, it means throwing caution to the wind sometimes and being like, all right, I'm going to eat this. And like, I will probably feel crappy today. Yeah. And that's fine too, because tomorrow is always a new day. And that's the beauty with blood sugar metabolism, especially, is that we do not have to be perfect at all times. If we can be better in the morning, that's better than trying to be careful at lunch or dinner, because again, it just has a bigger impact and kind of lights the craving roller coaster on fire when you start in the morning. But there's definitely always tomorrow. One of my mantras is tomorrow there will always be more kale.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And I honestly think that the utilization of continuous glucose monitors just does not get talked about nearly enough. I think they're, thrown out as a tool for people who are diagnosed diabetic to kind of see what's going on a more continuous scale. And I think there's, maybe a more extremist use of them like dictating your entire nutrition plan. But I love this concept of using it to basically run experiments on yourself and see, how do I respond to sweet potato? How do I respond to white potato? How do I respond to when I have lots of protein with this carb? How do I respond? And we could learn so much from our body just with that like 1 to 2 week experiment on how we pair foods and what that looks like, and fasted over the morning and focusing on breakfast. I agree, is such a big thing to do.
Yeah. And I would say you can do these experiments without the continuous glucose monitor too. If you just, I have a worksheet in the book actually that'll help you understand like which symptoms to look out for. Cool. Is it brain fog? Is it, a mid-afternoon energy crash? And also noting what is happening with our sleep, what's happening with our stress levels. We mentioned, cortisol levels not being ideal for most of us. And by the way, that actually really does affect your carb tolerance. Right. When we're not in rest and digest mode, when we have cortisol flowing through our body biologically, it's because usually there was a threat that needed our attention, our immediate attention, and more importantly, our muscles, i.e. like a big animal that we needed to run away from. So naturally, when our cortisol levels are high, it's also going to signal to our body that our blood sugar needs to be higher as well, because we need that readily available energy to fuel our muscles to get away. But when we're sitting at our desk, just, receiving a passive aggressive email and our cortisol level goes up and our blood sugar goes up, again, that's going to mean whatever you're eating in that moment, even if you have the fiber in there and whatnot, you're not going to have as positive a reaction to it as you would another time. So I think back to your question of how women can be more comfortable eating carbs, I would say for me, and this is lessons that I've learned from doing a lot of research on gut health as well, is that but oftentimes how we're eating is just as impactful as what we're eating. And if you're stressed about, kind of either the omission side of things or stressed about the reintroduction side of things, refocus your attention onto some of these other wellness spheres, sleep and stress being two really big ones, because it may sound fluffy and woo woo and like, oh, yeah, sure, like that's not going to make a difference, but it absolutely does.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really important reframe for people who maybe are sitting there going, I already eat really healthy and nothing is
Mm,
changing. And what do I do now? Where do I go from here? When it might not actually be your diet. It might not actually
yeah.
be the makeup of your nutrition, but it might be stress. Or even, yeah, like when are you eating your meals? Are you sitting at your
Yes.
desk and like shoveling them in and answering stuff at the same time, which is like guilty. I used to do that. Now I have a very
Totally.
structured, like 1 hour step outside of my office. I work from home, so like there's
Oh.
no excuse for me to be able to go and like sit in the sunshine
Mm,
and actually have like a restful meal. And truthfully, I do feel a big difference between like my afternoon energy when I have a meal that I'm actually sitting down away from my phone, away
mm.
from my laptop, breathing when I'm eating versus fork, fork, typing, fork, fork, typing, which no one really can digest in that headspace properly.
Absolutely. And if, that's not available to you as an option, one of the things that my husband and I have integrated pretty successfully is just kind of before a meal. I know some people say grace. We do like a little gratitude practice, and it just at least is like a safety net for like stopping
Yeah,
us
I
from
love
just
that.
like diving right in and like inhaling our meals. And that really does help our mind gut connection drop into rest and digest mode. And
Mhm.
therefore, you're going to, again, because our hormones will reflect that, you're going to have a better tolerance to the carbs on your plate.
Right. How do we know from like a gut perspective if our food, whether how we're eating it or what we're eating, is something we maybe want to be thinking about for women in general, but like even just on the fertility journey as well?
Mm. I don't know, like what I would say the signs that something is wrong is, other than, the run of the mill IBS spectrum
Yeah.
symptoms and how your poop is looking, and yeah, just how you feel your digestion is functioning. But some things that I'm a big believer in for everyone, they're, really simple and obvious, but chewing. We just don't chew enough. Most people
Right.
don't do a good enough job with chewing. And that really does help our digestion, especially if we are lacking in fire and are a little bit more stagnant. Doing a little bit more of the upfront work can be really helpful. And then also to that effect, I am not a big fan of intermittent fasting, but I am an evangelist of meal spacing. I really do believe that we were biologically created to not snack all day long.
Right.
And it was really a discovery with learning more about SIBO. I learned more about the nerve wave, the migrating motor complex, the
Mhm.
MMC for short, which is responsible for kind of street sweeping the debris after a meal through our small intestine. So, our small intestine is where we absorb all our nutrients. Fiber is not something that we ever absorb. It passes through to the large intestine where it feeds our many amazing gut critters. But if that nerve wave isn't functioning properly, all of that debris can just get stuck in this long, craggy, winding tunnel. And that's where things can kind of go awry, because we do have bacteria kind of coming into our nose and mouth at all times. That's just what happens by way of living in the world. And when things start to stagnate, that's when you may get an issue like SIBO or IBS, or start to notice some issues. And the funny thing about the migrating motor complex is that it doesn't kick in unless you are in a fasting state of 90 minutes or more. So
Hmm.
that to me is just like, okay, like, yeah, we're not meant to be
Yeah.
snacking all the time. Because even if it's a really healthy snack, like almonds or carrot sticks, the migrating motor complex does not discern between
Right.
those things. It's still not going to kick in. So I think that's hugely important for our digestive health. And then I also think it's one area where kind of the blood sugar metabolism data and digestive data overlap because, in terms of our blood sugar, people get really kind of hung up over the idea of like a glucose spike.
Right.
And obviously, we don't want things to skyrocket because what goes up must come down. But I'd say that kind of the more macro thing to pay attention to is to just make sure that you're not having crazy volatility at all times. I personally am a believer, I don't have the data to back it, that going up and down all day long versus maybe going for a slightly higher peak 3 times a day at meals is putting a lot more stress on your body because your organs still have to do all that work. Your hormones still have to jump into gear. Your pancreas has to, get out there and pump out some insulin, and your liver has to be constantly converting things. And it just can exhaust your system. So I think building in time in between meals to let your digestive system do its job and catch up and to let that migrating motor complex kick in is really important. And I know a lot of people get hungry in between meals and are like, I can't do it. I can't leave 4 or 5 hours in between meals. It's just impossible. And again, there are baby steps to be had. I would say that maybe, and I'm not a practitioner, so you can tell me what your thoughts are, but we can work on making sure that those meals are keeping us fuller for longer. A lot of women are afraid to eat bigger meals. Yeah. So I say sometimes I would put more of an emphasis on eating bigger meal than snacking in between, and working on our blood sugar slowly but surely, to ensure that we're not having, the roller coaster that leads to cravings in between meals.
Yeah, I think if you're like an hour out of a meal and you're ready to go and sit down and eat again, and it's not just a peckish kind of habitual, I want something sweet, but I am actually hungry, we got to look at what did that meal actually consist of? Like you said, was it big enough? Did it have enough protein? Did it have enough fat? Like if it's a healthy, and especially we actually literally just had this conversation in private practice this morning with a client of mine who's a very healthy eater. And I think that when we do have a very clean diet, we have to remember that portion size needs to be bigger because we're often eating a lot more less calorie dense foods, which are great, and a lot more veg, which is great, but we need to make sure we're eating larger proportions of that to hit those requirements and getting that protein in. So I do think that's a really good kind of piece for people to look at. And then with the snacking, I was just like, while you're saying that, I was kind of playing in my brain, like, what does my day look like? Because I know for me, I have to have at least one snack to hit my goals when it comes to macros. And I just can't physically, I just can't eat three large enough meals. Could I do better at breakfast from like a calorie density standpoint? Like probably. So maybe there's some room for improvement there, but I was kind of looking at my day going, okay, if we want to have a few hours to let that MMC do its job, I probably shouldn't snack between breakfast and lunch because it's a shorter time frame for me. But lunch and dinner can sometimes be 6.5 hours apart.
Yeah.
I could fit a decent snack in there and maybe not have as big of an implication. And so figuring out what that looks like for you based on when you typically eat and what that looks like, there's ways to kind of make it work. And I think this is just also a really good opportunity to say that everyone out there that's like, you have to eat exactly in this manner, that's just not the case, right? Everyone's so individualized and everything needs to be based on what your body needs. And so if one strategy doesn't work for you, that doesn't mean that you're the problem. It just means that that strategy is not for you.
For sure. And I will say, if you're someone who's doing a really intense workout during the day, like disregard what I have to say, like you might need that snack to replenish your energy levels. Or you might need that snack before your workout, because your muscles are going to be requiring a lot of readily available energy to do their job.
Yeah. And they're going to require that energy after to repair and deal with the glucose that's being put into your bloodstream while you're working out. So there's always going to be nuances to it. I think that we just have to kind of, sometimes I just wish we could just take the pressure off the nutrition conversation, especially for women who are trying to conceive, and really just work within what feels right for them, because everyone's always searching for that like magic bullet diet that's going to fix all of the problems. And the reality is that doesn't exist. It really comes down to what's right for you and for your body.
Absolutely.
We covered so many things here, which was wonderful. How I always end my episodes is, what is one piece of fertility advice, Phoebe, that you would love to leave for our listeners?
Oh man. Well, I've had such a complicated roundabout journey that we didn't even talk about.
Right.
But I would say, and this is honestly my advice for people with gut issues as well, or just with any sort of chronic issue, or just anyone feeling out of balance, is, again, I do feel like we get really hung up on the diet piece, and there are just so many different ends. For me, body work has been hugely helpful, both in my fertility journey and also when I was healing from SIBO. And I didn't necessarily think it was, I was like, I don't think I have like any structural issues that are getting in my way. But the body is an amazing thing. Everything is connected. Our alignment, our nervous system, all of those things can be boosted by other modalities other than diet. And I do think that body work, acupuncture, even like some stress management strategies, or mental health strategies like hypnosis. All of these things are really, really data backed, not necessarily for fertility. I don't know the data there, but for gut stuff, absolutely. So I would just say, if you're feeling frustrated with the food piece, or just frustrated and feeling like you're not making enough progress as you would like, just try some of these other modalities and see what happens.
Yeah, I think that there's lots of data in the fertility world with all of those things. So I think it's so important. And
okay, good.
Yeah. Great piece of advice. You did great. But I think it's something that, I mean, like, that's why I do what I do too, right? Like, these are things that aren't talked about in the mainstream medicine world. And there's a time and a place for that stream. Absolutely. And then there's also this whole other avenue for you to walk down if you feel like you're not getting where you want to go.
Amazing.
How can we find more about you and more about your amazing sounding books?
Yes. So I have a blog called Feed Me Phoebe, and that has tons of free gluten-free recipes on there. Also, a lot of things I've written about SIBO and Hashimoto's. And then for the latest cookbook, Carbivore, unfortunately, autocorrect does me no favors and will autocorrect to carnivore. So go to carbivorecookbook.com to find that and the links, or just like be patient with whatever your search engine is and make sure it's not autocorrecting. And then you can find me on Instagram at Phoebe Lapine.
Amazing. I'll make sure all that information is in the show notes for everybody. For joining me, Phoebe. I really much enjoyed our conversation. I think we could probably have another session together and cover so many more things. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much.